The glow of the city illuminated the glass of the skyscraper, giving Daniel Carter a reflection he barely recognized. From the outside, he had everything anyone could want. 32 years old, founder of a promising tech startup in New York, featured on business magazine covers, invited to exclusive investment galas. His life was the epitome of success. Or so it seemed. But the image he saw in the window told him something else. Something he couldn't name, but felt in the weight on his shoulders, in the tightness in his chest, in the sensation that, at any moment, everything would collapse. Behind him, the meeting continued. His team presented projections for the next quarter with charts and figures on a massive screen. Confident voices, precise strategies, growth expectations. But Daniel was barely listening. A voice in his mind, faint but insistent, whispered, "This whole thing is going to collapse." "Mr. Carter, what do you think?" An analyst's question pulled him out of his trance. He blinked, as if waking from a long dream. He had no idea what had just been said, but it didn't matter. His response was automatic. "Yes, let's move forward," he said firmly, though inside, he felt like he had just made another mistake. It had been like this for weeks. Something inside him was telling him that something was wrong, but he didn't know what. His company had lost key contracts, his team seemed increasingly distant, and anxiety clung to him like a lingering shadow. When the meeting ended, he locked himself in his office. He poured himself a whiskey and walked to the window, watching the endless traffic of the city. "Why do I feel like everything is slipping through my fingers?" He pulled out his phone and checked his email. An offer was waiting for him. A multinational company wanted to buy his startup. An opportunity any entrepreneur would jump at without hesitation. But instead of excitement, he felt panic. It wasn't the first time. Every time he was about to achieve something truly big, something inside him held him back. He made mistakes, delayed decisions, sabotaged key relationships. It was as if there was something within him programmed to fail just when success was within reach. That night, he attended a networking event. Practiced smiles, firm handshakes, glasses of wine poured with precision. He feigned enthusiasm, posed for photos, talked about innovation and growth with investors who saw him as a safe bet. But inside, he felt only emptiness. When he arrived at his penthouse, he loosened his tie and collapsed onto the couch. An uncomfortable silence filled the room. He pulled out his phone and opened a dating app. He swiped mindlessly. He wasn't looking for anyone in particular, just a momentary distraction. Something to make him feel present, even if only for a few minutes. "Why do I always do this?" He stopped, sighed in frustration, and closed the app. It wasn't just in business. His personal life was a reflection of the same story. Every relationship ended the same way, with him walking away for no apparent reason. There was always an excuse. Too much work, too much pressure. Lies. He stood up and walked to the bathroom. In front of the mirror, he looked at his face with a mix of anger and confusion. "What the hell is wrong with you?" he whispered, as if speaking to someone else. He closed his eyes and took a deep breath. And then, without warning, the image appeared in his mind. His father, walking away, his back turned, crossing the doorway when he was 8 years old. His mother crying. His voice repeating the same phrase over and over, "Money changes people." Daniel's eyes snapped open. A chill ran down his spine. He didn't understand why, but that image haunted him. And deep within, he knew that somewhere, buried in the forgotten corners of his memory, lay the key to everything. The hum of New York's night traffic filtered through the windows, filling the room with a distant echo. Daniel stared at the ceiling, unable to sleep. The image of his father walking away when he was 8 years old continued to haunt his mind. Like a stubborn ghost, he got up and walked to the kitchen. He poured himself a glass of water and rested his hands on the counter, feeling the weight of something he couldn't define. Something inside him was wrong, but he didn't know what. Then, His mind began tossing around memories like pieces of an incomplete puzzle. Flashback 1, a ruined business 5 years ago. His first startup was about to take off. He had interested investors, eager customers, and a clear vision of the future. But suddenly, he hesitated. He started delaying important meetings, ignoring urgent emails, letting things fall apart without doing anything. He convinced everyone and himself that the market, the competition, and the crisis were to blame. But deep down, he knew the truth. It had been him. "You weren't ready," he told himself at the time. But now, in the solitude of his kitchen, he was beginning to wonder if that excuse was real or just another lie. Flashback 2, a lost relationship, years ago. Emma. She was different. Brilliant, passionate. She saw something in him that even he himself couldn't see. For the first time in his life, he felt safe enough to imagine a future with someone. But when Emma started talking about long-term plans, about real commitment, something inside him activated. Without realizing it, he began to distance himself. He ignored messages, canceled dates, made excuses until one day, in the middle of a silent dinner, Emma looked at him with eyes full of sadness and said, "I don't understand why you're pulling away, but it's clear you don't want to be here." And he left. Like everyone else in his life, Daniel closed his eyes and took a deep breath. It's always the same. Just when he was about to accomplish something important, his own mind pulled him back. It was as if he was programmed to fail. His phone vibrated on the table. He looked at the screen. Elijah. He hesitated before answering. "Are you still awake?" His friend's deep voice asked. "I can't sleep. Meet me at my office in an hour." Daniel sighed. He didn't feel like talking, but he knew he needed help. An hour later, in Elijah's office, Elijah had been a successful businessman until an emotional breakdown forced him to stop. He sold his company and dedicated himself to psychology. Now he helped others face their inner demons. Daniel sank into the black leather chair. "Something is wrong with me, Elijah. Every time I'm about to achieve something big, something in my head tells me to screw it up." Elijah studied him in silence before replying calmly, "Sometimes the biggest enemy is within us." A shiver ran through Daniel. "Explain." Elijah smiled slightly. "Tell me something, Daniel. What beliefs were you taught about success as a child?" Daniel frowned. "I don't know. That you have to work hard, that money isn't everything." "And anything specific about money?" Daniel felt a lump in his throat. "Money changes people." His mother's words hit him like an unexpected blow. Elijah nodded as if he had read his thoughts. "Maybe your unconscious associates success with something dangerous. Maybe, deep in your mind, you believe that if you succeed, you'll become someone you don't want to be." Daniel felt the ground open beneath his feet. "You mean I'm sabotaging myself on purpose?" Elijah shook his head. "Not on purpose. Your unconscious is simply trying to protect you from something it associates with pain. But until you understand exactly what that is, you'll keep repeating the same pattern." Daniel stared at them floor, feeling like his world was crumbling. "And how do I figure it out?" Elijah smiled. "You have to look inside. And that's the scariest part." Daniel woke up suddenly, breathing heavily, his heart pounding in his chest. The dream still burned in his mind, an echo impossible to ignore. A house in ruins. He remembered every detail with terrifying precision. The cracked walls, the peeling paint, the dust covering everything like a blanket of abandonment. In the dream, he was trying to open several doors, but they were all locked. He felt something watching him from the darkness of the hallways. A chill ran down his spine as he groped his way forward. And at the end, the door slightly ajar. When he tried to push it open completely, a child's voice whispered his name. That's when he woke up. Sitting on the bed, still feeling the anguish in his chest, he rubbed his hands over his face and looked at the clock. 5:12 a.m. He couldn't go back to sleep. The images from the dream haunted him even with his eyes open. The locked doors, the feeling of being trapped, the child's voice. He got up and walked to the kitchen. As he poured himself a coffee, Elijah's words echoed in his head. Your unconscious is just trying to protect you from something it associates with pain. But protect him from what? He picked up his phone and searched for the meaning of dreaming about ruined houses. What he found sent a chill through him. Houses in dreams represent our mind and emotions. If the house is in ruins, it can symbolize wounds from the past that have not yet healed. Daniel felt a cold shiver run down his spine. There was something buried in his mind, something he didn't want to remember. Hours later, at his company, he arrived at the office, trying to shake off the unease the dream had left him. But reality gave him no respite. As soon as he stepped through the door, his assistant intercepted him, her expression tense. Mr. Carter, there's a problem with the company's sale negotiations. Daniel felt his body tense. What happened? The investors are pulling out. They say they've noticed inconsistencies in your leadership and don't want to take the risk. Daniel's stomach dropped. Inconsistencies? They didn't say it outright, but they mentioned your changes of opinion, impulsive decisions, lack of clarity and strategy. It was his pattern repeating itself. Again, he had hesitated. He had delayed key decisions. He had canceled important meetings, all without realizing it, as if his own mind had orchestrated the sabotage. Again, anger hit him hard. Not at the investors, not at his team, at himself. He locked himself in his office and slammed his fist on the desk. Why did he always do this? Why, when he was on the verge of something great, did he feel the need to run away? He looked at his reflection in the dark screen of his computer, and in his own eyes, he saw the fear he always tried to ignore. Fear of success. Fear of becoming someone he despised. Fear of his own past. He sank into his chair, burying his head. In his hands, the locked doors in his dream, the ruined house. The child's voice. There was something behind those doors, something his mind had blocked out for years. And now it was time to open them. The sound of rain hitting the windows of his office filled the silence. Daniel hadn't moved a muscle since. He had dropped into the chair. Fear of success. He had never seen it that way before. But now it all made sense. His unconscious mind had been protecting him from something he himself couldn't understand. He closed his eyes and, for the first time in a long while, let the memories surface without resistance. He was 8 years old when he watched his father walk out the door with a suitcase in his hand. Dad, where are you going? His father didn't answer immediately. He crouched down and ruffled his hair. I have to work, son. It's important. His mother stood in the doorway, saying nothing. She just looked at him with eyes full of something Daniel at the time couldn't quite identify. Resignation. The car started, and his father disappeared into the distance. He didn't come back for weeks. Daniel didn't understand why his father was always busy, why he could never come to his soccer games or help him with his homework. But what confused him the most was the way his mother spoke about him when he was away. Money consumes everything, she would say while preparing dinner. It changes everything. What do you mean, Mom? People like your father never have enough. They always want more, and by the time they realize it, they've lost everything else. Daniel didn't know how to respond. He only knew that he hated those words because every time his mother said them, her voice sounded lonely. He hated money because in his child's mind, he blamed it for taking his father away. Years passed, and his relationship with his father grew cold, distant. He saw him as someone who had chosen work over his family. And without realizing it, Daniel made himself a promise he would never be like him. Back to the present. Daniel opened his eyes and felt an emptiness in his chest. Everything was there. Money consumes everything. It changes everything. I will never be like my father. But what had he done with his life? He had become a businessman obsessed with work. He had sacrificed relationships, moments of happiness, all in the name of success. At what point did I become him? He picked up his phone and called Elijah. "I need to see you." Hours later, in Elijah's office, Elijah listened in silence as Daniel told him everything. "Every time I'm about to achieve something important, I self-sabotage. Now I understand why. My subconscious believes that if I succeed, I'll lose everything I love, just like my father did." Elijah nodded, a slight smile on his face. "That's a huge realization, Daniel. Your unconscious mind has been operating under a belief that was formed when you were a child." Daniel frowned. "A belief?" "Yes, limiting beliefs. They are ideas we accept as absolute truths without ever questioning them. Your mother taught you that money destroys people, and as a child, you believed it without hesitation. Your unconscious adopted it as a rule and has been protecting you from becoming one of them ever since." Daniel felt the air grow heavier. "But that doesn't make sense. I know money isn't bad. Your rational mind knows that, but your unconscious doesn't see it that way. To it, success equals abandonment." Elijah paused before adding, "That's why every time you get close to succeeding, your mind creates excuses to walk away. It's not trying to hurt you, it's trying to protect you." Daniel ran a hand over his face. "So what do I do now?" Elijah looked at him intently. "Now comes the hard part. You have to reprogram your unconscious." Daniel felt a lump in his throat. "How do I do that?" Elijah smiled. "By looking straight into the eyes of what scares you the most." The wind howled fiercely that night, slamming against the windows of Daniel's apartment as if trying to tear down his own certainties. Sitting in the darkness of his living room, with the dim light of a lamp barely illuminating the contours of the room, his mind was a whirlwind of unanswered questions. He felt trapped in a dark tunnel, feeling his way forward without knowing what he would find on the other side. Looking into the eyes of what scares you the most. Elijah's words echoed in his head, insistent, inescapable. What was he really afraid of? For years he had been convinced that his father had abandoned him because of work, because of his obsession with success. He had imagined him as a cold man, incapable of prioritizing his family. But what if it wasn't that simple? He got up from the chair and started pacing the room. His thoughts dragged him back to childhood memories, to that day when his father walked out the door and never came back. He had always seen that moment through the eyes of a hurt child, a child who couldn't understand why his father chose the outside world over him, but he had never asked himself what his father had been feeling at that moment. The thought sent a chill through his body. What if my father was afraid too? A shiver ran down his spine like an omen, and then he remembered Dot at his mother's house. On top of an old closet in the attic, there was a dark wooden box. A box she had never wanted to open. That same night, Daniel drove through the rain to the house where he had grown up. His mother opened the door with a mix of surprise and nostalgia. "Son, I wasn't expecting you at this hour. I need to see Dad's box." His mother's face immediately tensed. "Daniel, why do you want to stir up the past?" "Because I need answers." She looked at him for a long moment, as if she could see straight into him, then sighed in resignation. Without another word, she led him to the attic and pointed at an old trunk covered in dust. "It's in there." Daniel opened it with trembling hands. Among yellowed documents and faded photographs, he found an envelope with his name handwritten on it. A letter. His father had written him a letter. For a moment, he stood frozen, the envelope between his fingers. He could feel the ink soaked into the paper, an echo from the past he had never heard. He swallowed hard, broke the seal, and began to read. "Dear Daniel, I don't know if you'll ever read this, but there's something I've always wanted to tell you and never had the courage to say in person. I know you must have grown up believing that I left because work was more important than you. But the truth is, I didn't leave because of work. I left because I was afraid. Since you were a child, I saw a potential in you that scared me. I knew you were going to be greater than I ever was, that you were going to achieve things I never had the courage to pursue. But at the same time, the idea of failing you terrified me. I always felt like I wasn't enough for you or your mother. Success was never my enemy, the fear of not measuring up was. And instead of facing it, I walked away. I hope one day you can forgive me. But more than anything, I hope you don't repeat my mistake. Don't let fear make you run away from what you loved most. With love, Dad. Daniel's hands trembled as he finished reading. It hadn't been work. It hadn't been money. It had been fear. His father had spent his life believing he wasn't enough. And now, without realizing it, Daniel had inherited the same belief. He clutched the letter to his chest. Elijah had been right. His self-sabotage was nothing more than an emotional inheritance. Now he understood why he had always pulled away from success. Because deep down, he still felt like a child who wasn't enough. But now, for the first time, he saw the truth clearly. It was time to break the cycle. Daniel sat on the bed, feeling the moisture on his face. He ran a hand over his cheeks, wiping away the tears that were still slowly falling. His breathing was slow, different. As if, somehow, something inside him had finally let go. He looked around the dark room, illuminated only by the faint moonlight filtering through the window. Everything felt clearer, lighter. For the first time in years, he didn't feel like he was running away. He stood up and walked to the small desk where he had left his father's letter. He took it in his hands again, but this time, he didn't look at it with resentment or sadness. He looked at it with understanding. He closed his eyes and took a deep breath. He had spent too much time blaming his father, using him as an excuse to run away from success, from love, from life itself. But his father had not been a monster. He had simply been a broken man, trapped in his own fears, just like him. And now, Daniel had a choice. He could keep repeating that pattern, or he could break it. I don't want to keep running away. The words left his lips with a new confidence, a determination he had never felt before. He turned and grabbed his phone. He hesitated for a second, but then searched for a number he hadn't dialed in years. After a few rings, a voice answered on the other end of the line. Daniel? His heart raced. It was his mother's voice. Mom. His voice broke slightly, but not from fear, from emotion. I want to see you. A silence. Are you okay? She asked, her tone a mix of surprise and concern. Yes, he answered, a weak smile forming on his lips, for the first time in a long time. Yes. Another pause. Then his mother's voice came back, softer this time. Then come home, son. Daniel nodded, even though he knew she couldn't see him. I'm on my way. He hung up and exhaled. For the first time, he was ready to face his past without fear. He grabbed his jacket and stepped out of the room, leaving behind the shadows that had followed him for so long. This time, he walked toward the light. The ceiling of his room was lost in the darkness, but Daniel couldn't really see it. His mind was elsewhere, processing what he had just experienced. His chest rose and fell slowly, in rhythm with his breathing. Something inside him had broken. Or perhaps, something inside him had finally been built. He had spent years fighting an invisible enemy, running in circles, fleeing from his own shadow. But now, instead of continuing to avoid his reflection, he had embraced it. And for the first time in his life, he felt there was room for something new, but there was still a loose end. He sat up on the bed and picked up his phone. He knew exactly who he needed to call. His mother. For years, he had avoided that conversation. The woman who had always been by his side, yet with whom he had never dared to truly talk about his father. He had never asked her the truth. He had never given her the opportunity to tell her own story, until now. He dialed the number. The ringtone dragged on for a few seconds before a familiar voice answered. Daniel? His mother's voice sounded surprised but warm. "I need to talk to you about Dad." A tense silence filled the line. "Why?" she asked cautiously. Daniel swallowed, but his voice came out firm. "Because I need to understand." Another pause. But this time, he felt something in her give way. "Come home." Hours later at his mother's house. The clock on the wall read 11 at night. The house was silent, except for the faint creak of the wooden floor beneath their feet. Daniel and his mother sat in the living room, facing each other, separated only by the small coffee table. He looked at her more carefully than ever. He noticed the fine wrinkles on her face, the shadows under her eyes, the invisible weight she always seemed to carry on her shoulders. He wondered how many untold stories were hidden behind that tired gaze. He took a breath and decided to get straight to the point. "I always thought Dad left because work consumed him," he began. "But I found his letter. And now I know that he left because he was afraid. Afraid of not being enough." His mother's expression changed. Her lips tightened slightly, as if those words had stirred a buried pain. Daniel tilted his head slightly. "Is it true?" She looked away and sighed. "Yes." A chill ran down his spine. Hearing that confirmation from his own mother made everything weigh even more. "I always saw him as someone who abandoned us. But in reality, he ran because he believed he couldn't handle the weight." His mother nodded slowly. The silence between them was dense, but Daniel wasn't finished. "Mom, why did you always talk about money like it was something bad?" His mother looked up, surprised by the question. "What are you talking about?" "My whole life, I grew up hearing you say that money destroys people. That success separates families." She looked away, clasping her hands in her lap. "Where did that come from, Mom?" The woman exhaled slowly and sank further into the chair. For a moment, she was no longer the strong, resilient mother Daniel had always known. Instead, he saw a woman who had carried her own fears for far too long. "It came from my own family," she admitted. "I grew up in a home where money was always a source of problems. My father worked tirelessly but was never present. My mother always complained that money had changed him." She paused, her voice trembling. "So when I married your father and saw how he sank into work, how his fear consumed him, I was terrified that history would repeat itself." Daniel watched her in silence. For the first time, he saw clearly that his mother had also been trapped in her own fear, and without realizing it, she had passed it on to him. "That's why you always spoke badly about money," Daniel said with a tone of understanding. "Not because it was bad, but because you were afraid of it." His mother closed her eyes and let out a shaky breath. "Yes." A lump formed in Daniel's throat. For years, he had carried a fear that wasn't even his. He had inherited his mother's beliefs, her fear of success, her fear that money would take him away from the people he loved. But now he saw it clearly, and he no longer wanted to live under those inherited fears. "I won't keep repeating this story." The words resonated within him with a force he had never felt before. He looked at his mother tenderly. "Mom, I know we grew up with these ideas, but they don't have to define us forever." She looked at him with a mixture of surprise and nostalgia. "I don't want to keep living in fear of success. I don't want to sabotage myself because of ideas that were never truly mine." His mother swallowed, her eyes glistening. "And what will you do?" Daniel gave a slight smile. "I'm going to break the cycle." He had spent too much time running away from what he truly wanted, but that ended today. He wasn't afraid anymore. The night was cool as Daniel left his mother's house. He walked slowly to his car, feeling a lightness in his chest like he had set down a suitcase full of stones he hadn't even realized he was carrying. For the first time in his life, he clearly saw the fears that had governed his existence. And now he had the choice to stop obeying them. But he knew the real test had yet to come, days later. The sound of the keyboard filled Daniel's office as the door burst open. Carla, his assistant, walked in with a radiant expression and an unusual sparkle in her eyes. "Daniel, they just sent us a proposal, and it's big." He looked up, raising an eyebrow. "How big?" Carla walked to his desk and placed a folder in front of him. "An investment firm wants to partner with us to expand the company. We're talking about doubling operations in less than a year." The air seemed to grow thicker. Daniel took the folder and began reviewing the documents. Page after page, the numbers and terms confirmed what Carla had said. It was a solid, concrete offer, the kind of opportunity he had dreamed of his entire life. And yet, as he read, something inside him began to stir. At first, it was a slight tickle in his stomach. Then, a tension in his shoulders. And finally, the voice. "This is too much for you. What if everything goes wrong? You're not ready." Daniel closed his eyes. There it was again, the echo of his old fears, whispering the same warnings as always. His unconscious mind trying to protect him, pushing him into the safe zone of doubt and paralysis. But this time, he wasn't going to give in. "Daniel?" Carla asked, noticing his silence. He took a deep breath and opened his eyes. "Give me a minute." Carla nodded and left the office, leaving him alone with the folder in his hands and his mind at war. He leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes again. This time, not to escape, but to face what he was feeling. The anxiety was there. He recognized it, but he didn't try to suppress it. He simply observed it. He had learned that the only way to break the cycle was not to run away, but to go through it. He had learned that his fears weren't truly his own, they were inherited. He had learned that his unconscious mind wasn't his enemy. It was just a scared child trying to protect him, and he didn't have to listen to it anymore. He opened his eyes. His mind was clearer than ever. He grabbed his phone and dialed. "Carla, yes? Schedule the meeting with the investors." There was a brief silence on the other end of the line. "Are you sure?" Daniel smiled, more than ever. For the first time in his life, he wasn't running away. He was moving forward. Daniel sat in the boardroom, surrounded by investors with calculating expressions. The cold light from the windows illuminated the polished wooden table, reflecting the expectant faces of the businessmen. It was the kind of situation that would have paralyzed him before. A year ago, in a similar scenario, he would have felt a knot in his stomach. His mind would have found an excuse, a seemingly logical reason to reject the offer. He would have convinced himself that now was not the right time, that he needed more preparation. But this time, something was different. This time he was different. "Mr. Blake, what is your decision?" One of the investors asked, his tone patient but firm. Daniel looked down at the table for a moment. He took a deep breath and then looked up, meeting the eyes of every person in the room. In them, he saw expectation, doubt, curiosity. But in his own, he saw something he had never felt in a moment like this before. Certainty. "I accept the deal." Silence stretched across the room like a sustained pause in a symphony. He waited to feel the fear. He waited for the anxiety to creep in and make him question his decision. But none of that came. He only felt calm. The investors exchanged glances. They nodded. And within seconds, the discussion resumed, this time focusing on the details of the agreement. Daniel leaned back in his chair, listening to every word, completely present. This time, he had not run away. This time he had chosen differently. That night, sleep enveloped him with an unsettling familiarity. He was back in the ruined house. The walls were still tall and old. But this time, something had changed. The door he had opened in his previous dream was still ajar, allowing a faint glow to spill into the dark hallway. The house didn't seem so frightening anymore. Daniel moved forward with slow steps, looking around. With every step he took, something in the structure changed. The walls, once worn and cracked, began to rebuild. The broken windows regained their shape. The closed doors opened on their own. And at the end of the hallway, he saw him, the boy, the younger version of himself, that part of him that had been waiting to be seen. But this time, the boy was not afraid. He was smiling. Daniel stopped in front of him. For a long time, he had tried to ignore him, to push him out of his mind. But now he saw him clearly. The boy extended his small hand. Daniel took it, and in that moment, a wave of peace ran through his body. The boy nodded slightly, and then he vanished in a burst of light. Daniel looked around. The house was no longer in ruins. For the first time, his mind was at peace. The new dawn woke up with the first rays of sunlight caressing his face. He opened his eyes slowly, feeling the warmth in his chest. Something inside him had changed forever. He sat up in bed and let out a sigh. Inside him, a truth resonated with absolute clarity. The cycle had been broken. He was no longer afraid of success. He was no longer afraid of becoming who he was meant to be, because for the first time in his life, he felt free. The murmur in the meeting room gradually died down. Chairs scraped against the floor as the businessmen stood, extending their hands to seal the deal. Daniel stood firmly, shaking each hand with a confidence he had never felt before. He had done it. The contract was signed. His company was about to double in size. But for the first time in his life, it wasn't the number on paper or the expansion of the business that truly mattered to him. What really mattered was the sensation that vibrated within him at that moment. For the first time, he felt like he deserved it. It wasn't luck. It wasn't coincidence. It was the result of facing his fears, of breaking the invisible chains that had bound him for years. And that was worth more than any external success. That night, the aroma of freshly brewed coffee lingered in the air as the city outside kept moving, relentless and alive. The cafe had the same cozy atmosphere as always, the hum of conversation, the clinking of cups, the rhythmic movement of baristas behind the counter. Daniel sat across from Elias, who watched him with his characteristic serene smile. "So you closed the deal?" his friend asked, stirring his coffee. Daniel nodded and took a sip of his own. "Yeah, and the funny thing is, this time I'm not afraid of losing it." Elias narrowed his eyes with interest. "Why?" Daniel rested his elbows on the table, a small smile playing on his lips. "Because I understand something now that I didn't before." Elias waited in silence. Daniel set his cup down and took a breath. "I always thought success was something I had to achieve. Something that existed out there, waiting for me if I worked hard enough." He paused, meeting his friend's gaze with calm certainty. "But now I know that true success isn't what we accomplish on the outside, it's what we heal on the inside." Elias smiled and nodded slowly. "Exactly." Daniel looked away for a moment, watching the steady flow of people on the street. He thought about everything he had been through over the past few weeks, the fears, the repressed memories. His father's shadow, the boy in the ruined house, led to this moment. A moment where, for the first time, he didn't need validation anymore. He had nothing to prove, because, finally, he felt enough. He leaned back in his chair and let out a sigh of relief. "Elias," he murmured, "do you think we're all fighting our own shadows without even realizing it?" Elias took a slow sip of his coffee, his expression knowing. "Most people spend their entire lives running from their own shadow, but only a few dare to face it." Daniel nodded slowly. "And when we do, we stop being afraid." Elias smiled. "Exactly." Daniel looked out the window. The city shimmered with neon lights, cars weaving through the streets like the lifeblood of a living organism. The world kept moving, but inside him, everything had changed. He wasn't afraid anymore, because for the first time in his life, he was free. The silence in the meeting room was almost tangible. In front of Daniel, the contract lay waiting for his signature. The pen rested between his fingers, ready to seal the deal that would change his life. But something inside him resisted. A chill ran down his spine. His fingers trembled for just a second. Just enough for him to notice. And then he heard it. That familiar voice whispering in the depths of his mind, "You are not enough." Daniel gritted his teeth. "You've failed before. You will fail again." His breathing grew heavier. Better walk away before it hurts. He closed his eyes for a moment. It was his shadow, that hidden part of his mind, always lurking, waiting for the perfect moment to intervene. The unconscious is a silent guardian, a hidden archive where memories, beliefs, and fears shape our lives. No matter how much we desire something, if deep inside there's a belief telling us we don't deserve it, we will sabotage ourselves without even realizing it. Daniel exhaled slowly, allowing the voice to echo in his mind. He didn't reject it. He didn't fight it. He just listened. Because now he understood. Self-sabotage is not an enemy. It is a defense mechanism, a desperate attempt by the unconscious to protect us from a pain we have yet to face. But there's something the unconscious doesn't understand. That pain is over. We are no longer the scared children we once were. We no longer need to run. We need to choose. Daniel opened his eyes. He gripped the pen firmly, and without hesitation, he signed. The weight on his chest disappeared. Not because the voice had gone silent, but because it no longer had power over him. He leaned back in his chair, eyes fixed on the signed contract. For the first time, he had made a decision without being ruled by his shadow. For the first time, he was free. Most people spend their entire lives running from their own shadow, but only a few dare to face it. Now tell me, how many times have you self-sabotaged without realizing it? And how many more times will you do it before you finally face your own shadow? The silence in the meeting room was almost tangible. In front of Daniel, the contract lay waiting for his signature. The pen rested between his fingers, ready to seal the deal that would change his life. But something inside him resisted. A chill ran down his spine. His fingers trembled for just a second, just enough for him to notice. And then he heard it. That familiar voice, whispering in the depths of his mind, "You are not enough." Daniel gritted his teeth. "You've failed before. You will fail again." His breathing grew heavier. Better walk away before it hurts. He closed his eyes for a moment. It was his shadow, that hidden part of his mind, always lurking, waiting for the perfect moment to intervene. The unconscious is a silent guardian, a hidden archive where memories, beliefs, and fears shape our lives. No matter how much we desire something, if deep inside there's a belief telling us we don't deserve it, we will sabotage ourselves without even realizing it. Daniel exhaled slowly, allowing the voice to echo in his mind. He didn't reject it. He didn't fight it. He just listened. Because now he understood. Self-sabotage is not an enemy. It is a defense mechanism, a desperate attempt by the unconscious to protect us from a pain we have yet to face. But there's something the unconscious doesn't understand. That pain is over. We are no longer the scared children we once were. We no longer need to run. We need to choose. Daniel opened his eyes. He gripped the pen firmly, and without hesitation, he signed. The weight on his chest disappeared. Not because the voice had gone silent, but because it no longer had power over him. He leaned back in his chair, eyes fixed on the signed contract. For the first time, he had made a decision without being ruled by his shadow. For the first time, he was free. Most people spend their entire lives running from their own shadow, but only a few dare to face it. Now tell me, how many times have you self-sabotaged without realizing it? And how many more times will you do it before you finally face your own shadow? Chapter 12. The Awakening. The awakening. City slept. The lights of distant buildings flickered, reflecting in the windows of Daniel's apartment. Outside, the world continued its course. But inside, in the quiet intimacy of his bathroom, something profound was happening. Standing in front of the mirror, Daniel observed himself. The face staring back was the same as always, yet somehow different. This time, his eyes did not reflect fear. There was no doubt, no weight on his shoulders, just him. He leaned slightly toward the mirror, examining every feature, every line of his face, as if seeing it for the first time. And in some ways, maybe he was. A faint smile appeared on his lips, not one of euphoria, not forced, but a smile of recognition, of acceptance. Everything we refuse to face within ourselves manifests in our reality. Fears become obstacles, wounds turn into repetitive patterns, and the shadow becomes self-sabotage. Daniel let out a slow sigh and nodded, as if finally understanding a truth that had been waiting to be seen for a long time. But the day we choose to look within, the day we face our truth, is the day we wake up. He switched off the bathroom light and walked away. The reflection in the mirror faded into darkness, but this time, it was no longer an image distorted by fear. It was simply him. The screen fades to black. Final message appears in the silence. Your greatest enemy was never outside. It has always been within you. But within you also lies the key to set yourself free.